The forgotten Battle of Gallicano-Braga, and the Brazilian hero who fought there. The crater story. Picture this. Northern Italy, April 1945. A Brazilian sergeant and 16 of his men have just captured 18 German soldiers. But there's a problem, they can't guard them all and keep fighting. So the sergeant does something unforgettable. He marches the prisoners into a bomb crater, hands 2 grenades to his corporals, and says, "If any of them tries to climb out, don't hesitate. Throw the grenades in." End of conversation. That sergeant was Nestor da Silva, a farm boy from the Brazilian highlands. And that night, a field telephone rang with orders from the commanding general himself. Nestor was being promoted on the battlefield for bravery. But this story doesn't start at Montese. It starts weeks earlier in a place almost no one remembers, the combat at Gallicano-Braga. Brazil joins the fight. To understand Gallicano-Braga, you have to understand how Brazil, a country that had absolutely no business fighting in Europe, ended up sending 25,000 troops across the Atlantic Ocean. Brazil was neutral when World War II started. But in 1942, German U-boats began sinking Brazilian merchant ships off the coast. Not 1 or 2, 6 ships in just 12 days. Hundreds of civilians dead. The Brazilian people took to the streets, and the government declared war on Germany and Italy. The skeptics said, Brazil will go to war when snakes smoke pipes. So the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, the FEB, made the smoking snake their insignia. It was a giant middle finger to the doubters. In July 1944, the first Brazilian troops landed in Naples. By September, they were on the front lines in Tuscany. And among them was a 26-year-old second sergeant from a tiny town called Lagoa Santa. His name was Nestor da Silva. He had enlisted as a volunteer in 1938, risen through the ranks faster than almost anyone, and now he was part of the 11th Infantry Regiment, one of the toughest units in the Brazilian army. He had no idea he was about to become a legend. The FEB's first phase of operations was in the Serchio River Valley. This was September and October of 1944. The mission: push the Germans north toward the Gothic Line and liberate Tuscan towns that had been under Nazi occupation. Town after town fell: Massarosa, Camior, Monteprano. Then Fornaci, Barga, and Gallicano. Now here's where it gets interesting. The official histories describe the Serchio Valley phase as relatively light on combat. The Germans were retreating, the Brazilians were advancing. But that's not the full picture. Gallicano-Braga refers to a critical confrontation line in the hills and passes just beyond the town of Gallicano. This area, the slopes and ridges connecting Gallicano to the Braga position, was not a single-pitched battle, but a series of high-risk patrol engagements, probing actions, and firefights against German rearguard positions. The Germans hadn't just vanished. They had left behind snipers, machine gun nests, and booby traps across the hill country. Someone had to go in and clear them out. That someone was the 11th Infantry Regiment. And leading patrols from the 3rd Platoon was 2nd Sergeant Nestor da Silva. Nestor's role at Gallicano-Braga? So what did Nestor actually do at Gallicano-Braga? The records tell us that out of 18 combat patrols Nestor conducted during the entire Italian campaign, a significant number took place in this initial phase, in the Gallicano region. These were not reconnaissance strolls. These were combat patrols. Small teams of Brazilian soldiers venturing into no man's land, or worse, into territory that was still crawling with German forces. Think about what that means. A patrol in the Apennine Mountains in late 1944 looked like this: freezing temperatures often below zero at night, visibility limited by fog and snow. German positions dug into the high ground with interlocking fields of fire. Every ridgeline could hide a machine gun. Every abandoned farmhouse could be booby-trapped. And Nestor kept volunteering. According to his official combat citation from the period, Nestor was described as having proficient activity, spirit of initiative, spontaneity in sacrifice, and resourcefulness of action. That language comes from the December 12, 1944 attack on Monte Castello, but the qualities it describes were forged right here, in the cold hills of Gallicano-Braga. The Gallicano-Braga phase established Nestor's reputation. His superiors took notice. They saw a sergeant who didn't wait for orders when the situation demanded action. A man who could read terrain, anticipate German movements, and, most importantly, bring his men back alive. Those 18 patrols were the foundation. Gallicano-Braga was where the legend began. After Gallicano-Braga, the FEB moved to a much deadlier theater, the Reno River Valley, part of the infamous Gothic Line. And their objective was a mountain that would become the most famous word in Brazilian military history. Monte Castello. The Americans had tried to take it. So had other Allied units. It was a fortress of rock, ice, and German concrete. The Brazilians attacked it 4 times before finally breaking through on February 21, 1945. Nestor was there for the assault on December 12, 1944, one of the failed attempts. His combat citation from that day praises his initiative and sacrifice under fire. He didn't break. He didn't retreat until ordered. And when the next offensive came in February, he was right back on the line. From Gallicano-Braga to Monte Castello. Then to Castelnuovo, fierce house-to-house fighting in a medieval town turned fortress. The Brazilians were now some of the most battle-hardened troops on the Italian front. And Nestor had become the kind of sergeant that officers dream of, fearless, experienced, and utterly reliable. But the worst was yet to come. Montese, the battle that made him an officer. April 14, 1945. The Battle of Montese begins. This would become the bloodiest, most brutal battle the FEB ever fought. 426 Brazilian casualties in 3 days. Nestor was right in the thick of it. And then tragedy struck. His platoon commander, Lieutenant Ari Rowan, a decorated officer and one of the brightest young leaders in the regiment, was killed in action. At just 22 years old, Ari Rowan became one of the most mourned heroes of the Brazilian campaign. With their lieutenant dead, command fell to Nestor. He was still just a second sergeant. But he took over the platoon without hesitation. And then came the crater incident. Nestor and his squad of 16 men had pushed deep into German-held positions when they captured 18 enemy soldiers. 18 prisoners, 16 men to guard them. It was an impossible tactical situation. So Nestor did the unthinkable. He shoved them into a shell crater, handed fragmentation grenades to 2 corporals, and gave the order to blow them all up if anyone tried to escape. No one moved. Later that night, the field telephone rang at the forward post. On the other end, General Mascarenhas de Moraes, commander of the entire Brazilian Expeditionary Force. He was promoting Nestor to second lieutenant, on the battlefield for bravery. A battlefield commission is one of the rarest honors a soldier can receive. Mascarenhas himself spoke the words.
For having conducted himself in an exceptional manner in all combat actions, I hereby promote Second Sergeant Nestor da Silva to the rank of Second Lieutenant.
The war ended 3 weeks after Montese. Nestor returned to Brazil in February 1946 and married his sweetheart, Neva, who had waited for him through the entire war. But his military career was far from over. He went on to become a paratrooper and a master jump instructor in the Brazilian Paratrooper Infantry Brigade. He served a total of 34 years in the Army, retiring as a lieutenant colonel in 1972. His chest carried the weight of a hero, the Cruz de Comate de I class, Brazil's highest distinction for individual bravery in combat. The Medalha Sangue do Brasil, the Blood of Brazil medal. The Medalha de Campanha, the Medalha de Guerra. He was one of only about 643 soldiers to ever receive the Cruz de Comate in the entire history of the FEB. And by the end of his life he was the last one still alive. Nestor da Silva lived to be 108 years old. He passed away on May 30, 2026, in Brasilia. At the time of his death, he was the longest living FEB veteran ever recorded, 108 years and 321 days. He spent his final decades living quietly in the Brazilian capital, going to the bank, to the newsstand, to church. The kind of ordinary life that extraordinary men earn. Why Gallicano-Braga matters. Historians tend to focus on the big battles. Monte Castello, Montese, the surrender of the 148th Panzer Division at Collegio Fornovo, and those were undoubtedly decisive. But the story of Nestor da Silva reminds us that wars are also fought in the small places. Gallicano-Braga was not a name that made headlines. It was a name whispered between soldiers on patrol. A name that meant cold nights, sudden death, and the constant pressure of knowing the enemy was just over the next ridge. The quote often repeated about the Serchio Valley phase is that there were no serious confrontations. But for the men who walked those patrols, all 18 of Nestor's missions into no man's land, every confrontation was serious. Every patrol could be your last. Gallicano-Braga was where Nestor da Silva learned what kind of soldier he was. It was where he became the man who could later stand in a crater with 18 prisoners and not flinch. It was where the smoking snake first drew blood. From the fog of Gallicano to the flames of Montese. From a volunteer recruit in Minas Gerais to the last living holder of the Cross of Combat, Nestor da Silva's 108 years on this earth were many things, but above all, they were a testament to what it means to serve. The snake smoked. The snake fought. The snake never forgot.
If you want to learn more about the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, check out the sources in the description below, including the FEB Virtual Museum, the Brazilian Army's official archives, and the Association of FEB Veterans. Like this video if you learned something new. Subscribe for more stories of history's forgotten heroes. And remember, the next time someone tells you a snake can't smoke, remind them of Nestor da Silva.